207%. By 1946. An entire week, all for just $1. Hungary. August 1945 to July 1946. Highest monthly rate of inflation. 4.19 times 10 to the 16th power. Or this giant number. Equivalent daily inflation rate. 207%. Time required for prices to double. 15 hours. After World War II, like many countries, Hungary was left in shambles. Their industries were crippled, and what remained of their assets were seized by both sides of the war. So the amount of goods produced went down, but the amount of money in circulation stayed the same. So, inflation. But instead of trying to reduce the inflation by reducing the amount of money in circulation, which could have made the already dead economy worse, Hungary took a different approach. The government intentionally caused inflation by printing literally as much money as they could. What started out as 25 billion penge in July 1945 grew to 1.6 trillion penge 6 months later. Then just 4 months after that, the money supply grew to 65 quadrillion, which is a million billion. Then just another 2 months after that, to 47 septillion. That's 47 trillion. To make this a little bit more comprehensible, something that cost 379 penge in September 1945 went up to a trillion 10 months later. At one point, the government had to stop collecting taxes, because if they were late by just 1 day, it would have wiped out the value of the taxes the government collected. Needless to say, this would go down in history as the worst case of hyperinflation ever. Yugoslavia, April 1992 to January 1994. Highest monthly inflation rate, 313 million%. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 64.6%. Time required for prices to double, 1.4 days. Yugoslavia was a nation born in the wake of World War II that was made up of these modern-day countries. During the early days of the breakup of these nation-states in the early 1990s, the second worst case of hyperinflation occurred. Far an entire week. 0.19 times 10 / Jake Tram. Hungary. August 1945 to July 1946. Highest monthly rate of inflation. 4.19 times 10 to the 16th power, or this giant number. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 207%. Time required for prices to double, 15 hours. After World War II, like many countries, Hungary was left in shambles. Their industries were crippled, and what remained of their assets were seized by both sides of the war. So the amount of goods produced went down, but the amount of money in circulation stayed the same. So, inflation. But instead of trying to reduce the inflation by reducing the amount of money in circulation, which could have made the already dead economy worse, Hungary took a different approach. The government intentionally caused inflation by printing literally as much money as they could. What started out as 25 billion penge in July 1945 grew to 1.6 trillion penge 6 months later. Then just 4 months after that, the money supply grew to 65 quadrillion, which is a million billion. Then just another 2 months after that, to 47 septillion. That's 47 trillion. To make this a little bit more comprehensible, something that cost 379 penge in September 1945 went up to a trillion 10 months later. At one point, the government had to stop collecting taxes, because if they were late by just 1 day, it would have wiped out the value of the taxes the government collected. Needless to say, this would go down in history as the worst case of hyperinflation ever. Yugoslavia, April 1992 to January 1994. Highest monthly inflation rate, 313 million%. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 64.6%. Time required for prices to double, 1.4 days. Yugoslavia was a nation born in the wake of World War II that was made up of these modern-day countries. During the early days of the breakup of these nation-states in the early 1990s, the second worst case of hyperinflation occurred. Far worse than the Weimar Republic, yet it seems to have slipped under the public's consciousness. At its peak in January 1994, the official monthly inflation rate was 313 million%, or 4 times higher than the Weimar Republic. And the results were devastating. People's income dropped more than 50%, they couldn't afford food if there was any to be bought, bread lines, foreign gas stations were closed, foreign exchange black markets emerged. To put it into perspective, imagine the money you have in your bank account right now, then imagine moving the decimal point 22 places to the left. Then imagine trying to buy something. Then imagine trying to survive through this for 2 years straight, from the start of 2020 to the end of 2021, for example. Zimbabwe, March 2007 to November 2008. Highest monthly inflation rate, 79.6 billion %. Equivalent daily inflation rate, 98%. Time required for prices to double, 24.7 hours. After Zimbabwe gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1980, this opened up a whole new profession: politicians. Politicians whose first priority has always been to secure those votes to secure their seat in power. And how do you secure that public support as a politician who has control over the government spending? Offer free stuff. So offer free stuff they did, which created a spending problem for their government. Add on top of that a ton of other stuff like the government seizing farms from white farmers and giving it to black farmers that didn't know how to farm, which created a food shortage.
The situation was made worse by costly participation in the Congo War in 1998 and sanctions against Robert Mugabe's government in 2002.
The government blames its financial problems on sanctions imposed by the EU and US during Mugabe's reign.
The banking sector collapsing and the money printer going burr, and you have the perfect storm to nurture some hyperinflation. The general rule of thumb is that hyperinflation is when the monthly inflation rate is above 50%. And since 1998, Zimbabwe has been hovering around a 50% annual inflation rate. Mix in Zimbabwe's central bank continuing to tinker with the economy to try to slow down inflation, and by March 2007, the country was experiencing full-blown hyperinflation, with again it peaking around 79.6 billion % a month.
Prices in shops would go up several times a day, water and power cuts happened often, and there were queues at banks, petrol stations, and severe shortages of food in supermarkets.
A problem they're still struggling on and off with to this day.
This year, inflation is hovering at around 300%. That was the latest figure before Zimbabwe's finance minister put a moratorium on publishing numbers until next year.
Venezuela, 2013 to today. A situation caused by both political and economic reasons that range from the government controlling parts of the economy, shortages of food, electricity, medicine, riots and political instability that stem from that, oil revenue tanking even though they have some of the largest oil reserves on the planet.
Gasoline has been in short supply there for years. The shortage has now reached unsustainable levels and is hitting the capital Caracas in the middle of a pandemic.
Economic sanctions from the US and more, with hyperinflation starting at modest levels in 2013 to peaking at around 1.6 million % in 2018, with the Venezuelan central bank estimating that the currency was inflated by 53.8 million % between 2006 and April 2019.
There's no coffee, no flour, no oil, no butter, no cornflakes. There are a lot of food products missing that aren't luxuries, just normal food.
They were able to tame the hyperinflation back down to better levels in the low thousands of % in recent years, but that still means that for the average everyday shopper on the streets, prices for goods are doubling every few weeks. One woman said, "Everything is rising so quickly that what I deposit in my account doesn't buy anything. All we can do is eat less and stretch what we have." Which brings us to today, in the West. The United States, January 6, 2020 to January 4, 2021. Coming straight from the Fed, we started this period with around $4 trillion in the system. 1 year later, that number is at $6.7 trillion. Meaning that over 40% of all US dollars were printed in just the last 12 months.
Well, we've had an incredible surge in government spending. A lot of it related, of course, to COVID-19 and to the ordered, economic shutdown and the fact that a lot of people were no longer out there earning money. And so the government looked to replace what people were no longer earning by printing money, which is what they did. You had all this government spending, but there were no additional tax hikes to cover the cost, nor did the government try to prioritize any of its spending. It didn't say, well, maybe we should spend less on the military so we have more to spend on fighting the pandemic, right? They didn't budget their resources. They just said, well, we're just going to spend more money on the pandemic, but we're not going to spend less on anything else, and we're not going to raise anybody's taxes to pay for it. So where'd all the government spending come from? It doesn't come from, thin air. The money has to come from somewhere. And if they're not going to make room in the budget by cutting spending, if they're not going to increase taxes to get additional revenue, well, then they just crank up the printing presses. So that's where all this new money came from. The government printed it and spent it into circulation through all these programs.
And from the looks of it, No one seems to be in a rush to slow things down.
A sweeping nearly $2 trillion relief package to tackle this pandemic, one of the largest in our nation's history.
In fact, no one is really talking about this at all.
And right now, nobody seems to think that this is a problem. People seem to think that we've stumbled on the equivalent of a monetary fountain of youth. People like to call it modern monetary theory, which is we can have whatever we want as long as government prints the money to pay for it, that there's no limit, that government is free as long as they print money. Now, of course.
And strangely enough, we haven't seen much inflation for everyday goods like gas and food. Prices definitely haven't gone up anywhere near 40%, and other countries seem to be following suit. So the question remains, where's the inflation? The reason why we haven't seen inflation yet is because the amount of money being printed is only one of the factors that contributes to inflation. To get inflation, here's everything you need. Number 1, industrial output. How much stuff an economy makes. The more stuff, the more supply, which equals lower prices. The less stuff, the higher the prices. Number 2, employment. Too much employment leads employers fighting over workers, which leads to higher wages, which leads to higher prices. Too little employment leads to employees fighting over jobs, which leads to lower wages, which leads to lower prices. Number 3, the money supply. The main topic of this video and probably the easiest to understand. The more money in an economy equals higher prices, as long as the economy is producing the same amount of stuff or less stuff. And number 4, if the money is exchanging hands, and if so, how fast, also known as the velocity of money. If you print a bunch of money but that money is spent on food instead of gas, food is going to experience inflation, but gas isn't. If you want a more detailed explanation of this, I highly recommend you watch the video by Economics Explained on the subject. It will be linked below. And in our case right now, the money supply has shot up a ridiculous amount, but the other factors have been keeping inflation down. Industrial output, it's been down from businesses not being able to operate, which leads to less stuff. But there's also less demand from you and I to buy those things, so its impact on how much inflation we have is kinda neutral. Employment has also definitely taken a hit, and with less employment comes lower wages, which means lower prices, not inflation. And the velocity of money. It's pretty slow for everyone with all the uncertainty in the air. People don't want to spend money right now if they don't know if they're going to be able to keep their job or find a new one.
And I think the reason for that is a lot of the money that we print, as is always the case, ends up getting exported. If you look at our trade deficits, they surged to record territory, especially in goods, where we had all-time record high trade deficits. So a lot of that money got exported, and it wasn't here in the US where it would have been used to bid up the price of goods and services.
But you know what they are going to spend money on? Things that only go up, like Tesla stock, every other stock, real estate, and Bitcoin. So we are seeing plenty of inflation happening right now. The S&P 500 has seen around a 70% increase since its crash in March, the same exact period all these new US dollars were printed. Home prices have gone up by 8% since January, which is higher than usual, and pretty much everyone and their mom knows how well Bitcoin has been doing. But instead of calling it inflation, we call it the stock market rally, the real estate boom, crypto's time to shine, or the great crypto bubble, depending on who you ask.
When inflation pushes up asset prices, people don't complain because the people that own those assets, of course, feel much richer.
Right now, the downward pressures are counteracting the upward pressures, and we are in a fragile equilibrium.
So inflation can work its way into the economy through various methods, and so prices can be affected in different ways. But ultimately, it's consumer prices that are where all the inflation ends up once it, finishes making its way through the economy, because that's really all everybody wants. I mean, people don't buy stocks because they want to own stocks. They buy stocks because they think they'll be able to buy more consumer goods with the profits from their stocks. But ultimately, those profits have to be realized, and then they have to be spent on consumer goods, and the price of those goods can go up.
Which begs the question, should the money printer keep going burr? Can it keep going burr?
And I ultimately think we're going to see a real shock in terms of how high consumer prices are going to rise.
So you think that's how it's going to end up with all this money printing? It's eventually going to hit consumer prices?
Well, it always does. I mean, that's like the final resting place for inflation is in the end product, which is in consumer goods. But
those on the side of printing more and more money, spending more and more money, and not worrying about how much debt we have, the modern monetary theory camp, have an interesting argument. Their main thing is that since the government is the issuer of money, the creator of money, they don't have to worry very much about spending a lot, having too much debt, unlike people and businesses like us who are the users of money, because they can always print more to make the debt payments.
The line you want to draw between the federal government, let's say of the United States of America, and everybody else, that line that distinguishes their fiscal capacities, their spending capacities from ours, is really down to the fact that they can issue our currency, the US dollar, and the rest of us can't.
If a government issues its own currency, imposes tax liabilities or other kinds of liabilities in that currency, spends only in its own currency, and issues debt only in its own currency, then it basically can never run out of money. That is the basic of the argument.
With the only limit to how much money the government can spend, borrow, and print being the amount of stuff there is out there for the government to spend money on.
The limit would be the resources available for the government to hire or purchase. The government can't run out of finance, right? But the United States could run out of resources that are available.
Once that supply gets low, then we'll see prices rise and inflation rise. And if that's the case, we can spend, borrow, and print a lot more than where we're at right now before there's too much inflation. Assuming that's true, then we have a social responsibility to offer things like the government guaranteeing everyone has a job, the Green New Deal, stimulus checks, whatever.
The one that MMT is most associated with is the Job Guarantee Program, an unconditional, universal offer of a job to anyone who wants to work.
And the fact of the matter is, this is kinda how the world works right now.
People think that we're describing a new policy. We're not. We are describing reality. We're describing the way the US government spends, the way the British government spends.
But should this be how the world works in the first place? Should we just accept that the government should have a monopoly on money in the first place?
One way to think about it is the government has a monopoly on a certain thing. And so then why don't we get rid of that, right? If the government right now, Soviet Union, if they had a monopoly on agricultural output, yeah, there'd be an economist in there who could, his career would be writing books about proper Soviet planning of government, agricultural targets and so forth. But surely you would think that the right thing to do for the economist would be to focus on let's change this system. I don't understand why he's focusing on certain things and just conceding, yes, the government's going to have a monopoly on money and so forth, and that's the way it is. If any other entity did the sorts of things and then tried to justify them or just explain what they were doing the way in his writings he talks about what the government's doing, clearly that would be fraudulent. And the fundamental way that he came back and said there's a distinction here that you're not getting, Murphy, is that it's like there's a scorekeeper. And obviously, there's a distinction between the people playing the game versus the referee setting up the game. But then that just begs the question, why are we playing this game in the first place? Why is that guy the scorekeeper? It's because they have guns and are pointing them at us and saying, you're going to play this game is because you're going to get shot otherwise, all right? So since neither of us is describing the way the world literally is right this second, we're both explaining tweaks we want to make in this system, it seems to me that's kind of a big deal.
Our brains have not evolved very much in the last 10,000 years. That means that the same humans that caused all the other examples of hyperinflation, those same politicians with the same incentives that led to those disasters, are the same humans in our government today, with similar incentives. Are those really the people you want in control of the printing press?
So before this video, I really tried to understand the other side of the argument, the modern monetary theorists. On the surface, it kind of makes sense. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, it doesn't make sense beneath the surface, and it doesn't make sense on the surface either. Like, no matter where you go relative to the surface, it doesn't make any sense. But what is true, though, is that if a government borrows in its own currency, yes, it can go deeper into debt before suffering the consequences of its profligacy than a country that's borrowing in somebody else's currency that it can't print. So the day of reckoning will come later for a country that's borrowing in its own currency. But because the day of reckoning comes later, the problems get much bigger before that happens. So that means the ultimate consequences are much more severe. So you get away with it for a little longer, but then the pain is worse when you no longer get away with it. Because the idea that you get away with it indefinitely is nonsense. right? The bills have got to be paid eventually. And the longer you procrastinate paying them, the bigger the bill's going to be.
But when the government just prints money and gives it to you, right? When you have all these unemployed people who are sitting at home just getting a check from the government, they produced nothing. They added no goods or services to the economy, yet they can consume goods and services in the same proportions as if somebody had actually done work and actually been, a productive member of society. All this does is drive up prices, because if your work adds to the goods and services, and now you're consuming the goods and services you help create, that's fine. But if now you start consuming goods and services, yet you didn't help create any of those goods and services, you just have more money chasing a diminished supply of goods and services, and prices are going to go up. And they're going to go up like never before. And the irony of all of this is that the Federal Reserve has been promising Americans more inflation. Well, that's one promise that they're going to deliver on. In fact, they're going to deliver on it beyond their wildest expectations.
When you give government power, they usually don't like to give it back. So do you think there's ever going to be a time where they're going to slow down the money printer, or is it just going to continue forever?
Well, they can't do it forever, because at some point the money has no value. And, there's not much sense in printing money that buys nothing. So at some point they're going to have to turn off the presses. And in fact, hopefully at some point they're going to slow them down quite a bit. But, we'll see how long they can resist doing that, because doing it involves a lot of pain, short-term pain, economically, politically, that our leaders really don't want. And of course, if you look at all of the promises that they've made to the voters that can't possibly be paid for, rather than admit that none of this can is affordable, they can just print the money and act as if the government can provide these things. So given the type of leaders we have and their philosophy and the base, there's a good chance that they're going to push this as far as they can. I mean, until the dollar has completely collapsed, and then they just can't get away with it anymore. So before that happens, there's really no incentive for anybody to change.
Yeah.
Because as long as they can print money and people will accept it and the value doesn't go down too much, well, they'll just keep doing it, rather than being honest with the public and accepting the consequences.
One of the best ways to protect yourself against inflation and even hyperinflation is to have a great business. Because if you have the next big thing that people need, you'll be protected in any business environment. That's where Trends comes in.
You have no doubt seen images of people in Zimbabwe, Venezuela, or the Weimar Republic wheeling in trillions of dollars in bills to pay for groceries. And in many ways, this is seen as pretty much game over for any economy that experiences it. There are only so many zeros you can add to your banknotes before nobody takes them seriously anymore, and as soon as people no longer respect a currency, that currency is useless. Now, in all of these past examples, hyperinflation was caused by an unstable economy that the government desperately tried to mend with huge stimuluses funded by printing lots and lots of money. For those of you who have not made the connection, the US and dozens of other nations around the world in the last few months have been trying desperately to mend their unstable economies with stimulus packages funded by printing trillions of dollars. Since the money printers fired up in early 2020, the US has added over $3 trillion to its M2 money supply. That's more than a 20% increase in the total amount of money washing around in the economy in the space of around 6 months. What's more, is that $3 trillion is coming close to doubling the amount of cash in active circulation. That's the pool of cash which is actively out there being spent on goods and services rather than sitting dormant in a bank account or term deposits. When you consider that hyperinflation is classed as a 50% increase in general prices per month, it is reasonable to expect that this printing bonanza may be starting to push into dangerous territories. Or is it? Is hyperinflation actually something to be concerned about in developed nations like the USA? Or are all of these cautionary tales just a ploy to try and get people to buy gold coins at 50% over their base value? Well, to properly answer this, we need to of course look at a few key details and answer a few key questions. What actually is inflation? It's weirder than you might think. Is inflation actually good or bad for the economy? Is the money printer causing inflation right now? And what are the best ways to protect against this harsh reality? This episode of Economics Explained is brought to you by you, the viewer. If you'd like to help make these videos possible, as well as participate in exclusive live streams held every Saturday at 9:30 AM Eastern Standard Time, please consider supporting this channel on Patreon like these awesome people. And guys and gals, one more quick thing before we dive into today's video. There have been a lot of comments lately that YouTube sub boxes aren't working and upload notifications are not being received. So, if you guys want to make sure that you don't miss any new videos as soon as technically correct, it misses a lot of detail. The first part where this definition is a bit vague is the definition of goods and services. What are these goods and services? Well, that's simple, right? It's a selection of goods and services that are indicative of a standard household budget, all bundled up in what's called the Consumer Price Index. The Consumer Price Index is created by monitoring household expenditures and then looking at where that money is going. Now again, this probably isn't a huge surprise to people watching an economics video, but where this gets a bit weird is the methodology used to actually measure these figures. Most developed economies will delegate a national government department to watch these statistics. In the US, for example, it's the US Bureau of Labor Statistics. What they will do is monitor a few thousand homes in urban areas across the nation to get a baseline on what a set basket of goods will cost. And this is not yet actually considered the Consumer Price Index, but rather it is the Household Expenditure Survey. This causes one initial problem, which is basically Schrodinger's Consumer Price Index. You can't effectively measure something without changing the result. If a government agency is checking through your household's receipts, you're almost definitely going to change your spending. This isn't just big picture stuff either, like a little less money spent at CJ Entertainment, but also more mundane things. Just the idea that someone is reviewing your expenses will mean that you are thinking about the money that you are spending, which is more than what most people do in any given month. Because of this, household expenditure will trend downwards as people try to present a more fiscally conservative image of themselves. This can be really bad because the time series of these expenditure measures is what goes on to form the Consumer Price Index. So, government agencies could be working with pre-skewed figures. Now, Schrodinger's CPI measure is actually a relatively minor issue that most agencies are aware of and account for. But there is a more serious problem caused by a different type of government interference. Sales taxes and subsidies impact the Consumer Price Index. This isn't so much of a big deal during normal economic conditions, but sweeping government reforms can make these figures very blurry. In response to the economic downturn caused by the coronavirus, the Australian government introduced a stimulus package that would pay for childcare in an attempt to get younger workers to work. This saw a 95% reduction in household expenditure on childcare, the remaining 5% being made up of people that paid for personal nannies. Now, childcare in Australia, and most developed nations for that matter, is expensive, and it takes up a good chunk of regular households' budgets. So, completely eliminating this category will have some pretty serious impacts on these figures. The opposite is also true with taxes. Things like carbon taxes, sales taxes, liquor taxes, or anything else that impacts the price of a good directly is subject to a discretionary change by the government. For example, if a nation implemented a 5% blanket sales or value-added tax, it would look like inflation has spiked by 5%. And in many ways, it sort of has. Inflation measures the rising price level of goods and services. Taxes increase these price levels. But it does mean that governments can kind of tinker with the results by properly using these subsidies or taxes. Now, if this is accounted for, it's just fine. But if not, it can cause a vicious feedback loop of policies causing inflation to deal with the policies that are causing inflation. But all of this being said, there is a reason why understanding these limitations is so important. it helps us properly understand the mechanics behind what inflation actually is, beyond the rising price level of goods and services in the economy. This understanding means that we can properly ask, is inflation good or bad? It sounds like a really silly question, because of course inflation is bad, right? Things costing more and savings being worth less, how could that possibly be a good thing? This seems logical enough, but there are actually some very good reasons behind why most developed governments actually target a 1% to 3% inflation rate. Inflation is bad, and the opposite, deflation, is also bad, but deflation is worse. Deflation is when the prices of goods fall over time. So, this might actually seem like a good thing, but it causes some serious concerns. The first is that it reduces consumption. If things are becoming cheaper and cheaper every year, people will be more inclined to save cash and buy something superior later on. Why buy a Toyota Camry this year if that same money could buy a BMW next year? Now, this particular argument is actually disputed by a lot of economists that will note delayed gratification is still beneficial in today's economies, but one look at the world of easy finance and buy now, pay later will show you that people might not actually plan this far ahead. What is a more direct consequence of deflation is the impact that it has on debt. For example, if you have a $100,000 home loan at a 3% interest rate and the annual deflation rate is 2%, what this effectively means is that you are now going to be paying a 5% real interest rate, because every year your repayments become worth more and more. This hurts households with debt and means that people will seriously consider holding off on debt-fueled purchases, which can stifle a lot of markets. Everything from buying a new outfit with a credit card to starting a business with a bank loan will come with a little bit more of a pause for thought. Deflation also has a strange relationship with employment and wages. If cash is going to become more and more valuable every year, then a $50,000 salary will be the equivalent of a $51,000 salary in 12 months' time. This will likely mean that businesses are a lot less generous with nominal pay rises and a lot less generous with initial salary offers. If you throw in complications like a set minimum wage on top of this, it can become really murky. The idea of a $15 minimum wage is a big deal in American politics at the moment, and this would probably do a lot of good for the economy as a whole. But if deflation was a reality, we may see one of two things happen. One is that the minimum wage level would have to fall every year, which is probably going to be very politically unpopular. Or the second option is that businesses just won't be able to afford as many workers in lower margin roles. This effect is called real wage unemployment, and was a serious problem for Japan during the 1990s during a prolonged period of low inflation. The one last thing to remember is that goods getting cheaper and cheaper doesn't mean very much for the average household if wages are shrinking along with them. And there is a psychological component to seeing bigger salary figures over a working career that drives people to boost their lifestyle. For all of these reasons, most economists agree that inflation is better than deflation in moderation. That's why most economies and central banks target that 1 to 3% annual inflation rate. So, now that we have an ideal target, what is actually done to achieve this goal? What can governments do to keep inflation steady, and could this record stimulus be printing us off course? There is an unwritten rule in economics that anytime one thing is changed, at least two other things change along with it. There is actually no direct tool that governments have to control inflation, outside of becoming a complete command economy that sets the price level of everyone's beet rations. Although, there are tools that impact inflation as one of its side effects. The first is fiscal policy. Fiscal policy is just a fancy way of saying government spending and government taxation. The primary motivation behind these policies is to provide public goods, things like roads, schools, emergency services, and all that good stuff. But another key motivator is economic growth. The politicians and their advisors that dictate fiscal policy want their economies to become richer so that they can get re-elected. Therefore, a lot of thought is put into how changes in taxes and spending will impact things like employment and business growth. Fiscal policy can also be used as an emergency safety measure to keep the economy afloat during times of crisis, like printing $3 trillion to fund stimulus checks, unemployment benefits, and corporate bailouts. The second tool that governments have to influence inflation is monetary policy, which is again just a convoluted way of saying the raising and lowering of interest rates. Officially, this is handled by the central bank, which is technically an independent agency, but for the sake of simplicity, we will just say that fiscal and monetary policy are conducted in unison. Now, both of these policies influence four main things that in turn impact inflation. These things are industrial output, employment, the money supply, and the velocity of money. Industrial output is the first big one. If government spending can be put towards making an economy more efficient, it will be able to produce more output. Things like good roads, shipping ports, internet infrastructure can all massively increase how many goods and services can be produced within a nation. Being able to produce more stuff means that there will be more supply, which will actually decrease prices. But the opposite is also true. If, for example, all of the businesses in a country are forced to close down or massively limit operations, that means there will be less output, which means less supply and naturally higher prices. This is called cost-push inflation, and it's the worst type of inflation because it generally means the economy is just becoming poorer and desperate consumers are having to spend a larger portion of their paychecks on an insufficient supply of essentials. Unfortunately, monetary policy can't do anything about this, and short-term, even fiscal policy can be limited. But the best way to avoid cost-push inflation long-term is to make sure the economy is investing into infrastructure that makes every worker more efficient and more productive. Speaking of workers, employment is actually an important factor in fending off hyperinflation as well, because, believe it or not, too much employment can be a really bad thing. We're used to hearing about politicians promising more jobs, but if unemployment falls too low, it can almost be as bad as if it spikes too high. Imagine a world with 0% unemployment. Anybody who wants a job has a job. Sounds great, right? Well, imagine if in that same world an enterprising young entrepreneur wanted to start a new business. They can put out a hiring ad on job boards, but they are going to find it really hard to find applicants. Their only options would be to attract workers into joining the workforce, or, more realistically, poach existing employees off another business. With either option, they're going to have to make it worth that employee's while with a pretty generous pay package. Nobody is going to leave their job to join a new business unless they are getting a generous pay increase. What's more is that the business that this worker leaves is also going to have an empty position that needs to be filled. And again, they're going to have to offer more money to attract a worker from yet another company, which is going to need to fill that position, and on until wages become extremely high. Extremely high wages are great when they are the result of huge worker output, but when they are the result of a lack of supply in the labour market, it's bad because many businesses just won't be able to operate without charging a lot more for their products to cover the salary cost, which is inflation. There is actually a benchmark in economics called the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. What this rate is differs from economy to economy, but in a modern developed nation, as soon as unemployment starts to dip below 2%, inflation becomes a real issue. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, the opposite is also true. A high rate of unemployment, like the massive spike in people out of work we have seen in recent months, has a deflationary impact on the economy because people are willing to take any job regardless of the pay, and people out of work won't have as much disposable income to spend, so shops will be forced to run sales to attract what little consumer demand still exists. Now, the third variable is the money supply. Money supply is probably the hot topic issue at hand because, of course, it has been massively increased as the money printer has gone brrr. If there is more money washing around in the economy, and that economy is producing less stuff because, well, all the businesses have been forced to close, then naturally, that money is going to have less relative value. This is called demand pull inflation. because more people have more money in their wallets and they effectively pull prices upwards. This can actually cause a scary phenomenon known as stagflation, where unemployment and real growth is low, but inflation is still rising. Fortunately for now at least, it doesn't look like this will be an issue, and the reason for that is because of the fourth variable, the velocity of money. The Federal Reserve could theoretically print $100 trillion overnight, and it would do very little to the price level of things if that money wasn't actually out there being spent. The velocity of money is a measure that economists use to show how quickly money is changing hands. Now, money changes hands quickest in lower income households. If you give a low income household $1,200, they're going to use that money up very quickly, maybe buying some extra groceries or getting their car fixed or whatever it may be. Either way, that money is out there to be spent again and again and again. If you give that $1,200 to a multi-millionaire, they probably won't even bother cashing the check because that $1,200 is worth less to them than the time it takes to walk that check down to the bank. Even if the household of the multi-millionaire did spend this money, it is probably more likely to go towards things like shares, bonds, or term deposits, all things that are not part of the consumer price index and do not count towards inflation. So, now that we understand the four main contributors to inflation and how we can influence them, let's properly assess what the money printer is going to do. Industrial output has slowed, particularly in areas like tourism and hospitality, but consumer demand has fallen along with these declines, so overall the impact on inflation has been pretty neutral. Employment has of course dropped significantly, and more pessimistic workers with less confidence about their careers' futures are also spending money less rapidly, so the velocity of money has fallen too. Overall, having a downward pressure on inflation, especially in non-essential items. And finally, the money supply. Well, there's no getting around it. Introducing this much money this quickly to the economy has had an upwards pressure on inflation, but at least in most sectors, especially those covered in the Consumer Price Index, it has been more than counteracted by the downward pressures of employment and the velocity of money. What's really interesting is that you can actually go to your own government's website and find a detailed breakdown of these changes in price levels. Lo and behold, they tell a pretty similar story to the one that we have explored here. Of course, there are things to spend money on that are not captured in the Consumer Price Index, and there is a very real chance we are experiencing heavy inflation in these areas. So, are we free and clear of hyperinflation and or stagflation? No, not by a long shot. Right now, the downward pressures are counteracting the upward pressures and we are in a fragile equilibrium. Governments around the world have done what they needed to do to keep their nations afloat. But we have to pay for this eventually. We are either going to pay for this through taxation or inflation. One disproportionately impacts higher income earners and one impacts everyone. So, perhaps the pessimists amongst you watching might be able to speculate about what the more likely outcome is. All we can do in the meantime is hope that this future is managed carefully and make sure that we plan around this new reality, where inflation is going to be more present, more severe, and more influential.
Lenin said years and years ago, before Stalin, the best way to kill capitalism is to debauch the currency. I think there's something driving it, something driving me too. And I see the end, and I see the end coming. I think the end is coming. You can only, historically, like we had the Weimar Republic, which brought Hitler to power.
So after World War I, of course, Germany's production base was destroyed. And whenever you have a country with its productive base kind of damaged, plus they had external war reparations. So they had debts that they couldn't print away. It wasn't denominated in their own currency. And so they eventually experienced a hyperinflation as they basically printed money to finance deficits. Just because, after losing the war, after having all this, very challenging political and financial situation, you had more and more kind of populism and extremism build up, and then it took a really dark path.
I went to military school, so I studied military economics. And military economics was very concerned about guys like Lenin, Stalin, Hitler, Mussolini, Mao. And that's who we studied. And then socialist economics is Keynesian, which is you can print as much money as you like. And then capitalist economics, we were taught, was Mises' Austrian school, hard money, which is where Bitcoin and gold and silver kind of fit in. Our economics in school and business schools today in the US are socialist, Keynesian. You can print money. My concern is, I'm not trying to be racist here, but when the blacks, Americans are trying to get reparations for slavery, that's what happened in 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles, was they forced the German people to pay reparations to England and France. And that led to hyperinflation and then the rise of Hitler. And that's kind of what happened in 71 when Nixon took the dollar off the gold standard. They could print as much as they liked. That's the same thing that happened after 1918 with the Treaty of Versailles. They couldn't pay their bills. So the Weimar Republic just printed as much money as possible. And that's where the funny story comes in. A woman goes to the supermarket with a wheelbarrow full of cash, Reichsmark, and she goes inside to pay for her pork chop. And she comes out and they stole her wheelbarrow and left the cash. We had to crush production. That's what caused, Germany in World War I to die. And that's what happened in Zimbabwe. They wiped out the white farmers. I was there. It was horrifying. They were murdering all the white farmers. And now I was not in Venezuela, but I was in Colombia, where George was, watching the exodus out of Venezuela. And so if they've crushed the economy with this COVID shutdown right now, how many little guys are going out of business? It's sad.
One of the key things to watch is the destruction in production of commodities. And so, if you look at a lot of commodity prices, exception of gold and silver that have done really well recently, a lot of them are roughly the same price they were 10 or 15 years ago. And that's because we had this period of commodity oversupply. So, for example, a lot of cheap money allowed us to apply new technologies to get more oil and gas out of the ground. We had that period of kind of copper oversupply. And so a lot of those things were in a period of oversupply, and that feels really abundant. However, because prices have been in that kind of, they haven't been rising in many cases for several years, that incentive to get new production has diminished. Because we've had this period of commodity oversupply, some of the inflationary policy has not been very apparent in everyday life. Some areas we've had a lot of inflation in healthcare expenditures. We've had a lot of inflation in tuition, childcare services. But because commodities have remained relatively cheap, that hasn't really flowed out yet. Now, I think a key thing to watch is that going forward, some of the supply for these commodities is getting pretty tight. And when that goes up against very large deficits, that are in large part being monetized, you can start to see a general rise in commodity prices. And it's hard to say that's going to be next year or 3 years from now. But as we go deeper into the 2020s, I do think that's a really thing to consider, and that can promote a much more inflationary trend and problems getting the commodities we need.
In 1999, I said in 2016 the market would crash, but it didn't crash. And there's many reasons why it didn't crash. One reason was I didn't foresee quantitative easing.
Yeah.
I didn't think they would print that much money. I still can't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't believe interest rates would go below zero. So that's why it didn't crash. But it really was just a house of cards or a set of dominoes that was set to crash. And if I was a millennial, I'd be concerned. I'd be very, very concerned because the boomers like me, we had it so easy. Back when I graduated from school in 1969, there were high-paying jobs, stock market kept going up, real estate kept going up. It was fantastic. Baby boomers had life so easy. You bought a house. I remember the first house I bought, it was only like $30,000, and I sold it later for $150,000. Everything was just going up in price and all this. So the baby boomers are in serious trouble. The biggest crisis is the baby boomer crisis. Their pensions have been looted. They're gone. It all starts inside our banking system.
As you get deeper and deeper into this decade, so call it 5 years or so, especially because you have to figure out how much they're going to print, when are these commodity shortages going to become acute. But I think as we get roughly to the middle of this decade, I think that's where we start to run into some of these key shortages in things that have felt very abundant for the past 5, 10, 15 years. I think we're going to find ourselves in that period again, where we didn't invest enough in some of the production of some of these things. And as you point out, we had a really big destruction of small businesses this year. So for example, something like 100,000 restaurants have gone out of business, while larger corporations, because they have capital financing, in some cases they have bailouts, they have the Fed buying their bonds, they've been able to stay in business to a better extent than some of these small businesses. And so I think that a lot of these forces are going to kind of come to a head probably as we get roughly in the middle of this decade, would be my best guess.
With the right financial education, this crash would be the best thing that ever happened to you. But if you're thinking like my poor dad, PhD, poor, helpless, and desperate, you'll probably be just like him. That's the problem, because you have Uber is a complete stock market scam. You have WeWork, you have Peloton. Those are all your generation stocks, and they're complete shams. Mm-hmm. But they make a lot of money right now. So the reason I'm saying this is your greatest asset is this, your brain. What am I investing in? I'm still in real estate. You know why? Interest rates are so low. The housing prices are high. That's why there's a bubble in property. But I'm building old age homes right now, called senior living for me. As Kim says, she's reserved the penthouse for me. It's a big market. In 2020 to 2030, there'll be 2 billion old guys like me turning 65. Yeah. I'm investing in my friend's school. Now, why I'm investing in school is because he's going to buy the real estate for the school. I'm a real estate guy. But where does his money come from? It comes from the government. Because of the laws of America, every child must have an education. So every school is funded by the federal government and the state government. So my source of funds is really, really strong when I invest in a school. So I'm still investing. I'm just not investing in a 401k, ETFs, mutual funds, or I don't want a pension. Those are the differences.
How can we protect ourselves from inflation?
God's money and people's money versus fiat currency, what I call fake money. The more they print of it, the more worthless it gets. I don't save dollars. I mean, since I don't need dollars because I use debt, so my thinking is opposite. But I save gold, silver, and Bitcoin. And the reason is gold and silver are God's money. Bitcoin is people's money. But more specifically, gold, silver, and Bitcoin are not controlled by the Fed or U.S. Treasury. So that's my logic system.
I mean, what I used it for to begin with, YouTube, was to put my lectures online because they were popular and because there was some interest from television stations in Canada, a small television station, and they were a small hit by the standards of such things. And I thought, well, there's YouTube. I don't know what the hell YouTube is for. How about I record my lectures and put them on YouTube and see what happens? Maybe I can teach thousands of people instead of dozens of people, and why not? So I set up an iPad and a lapel mic, Scandal enveloped me. And then, well, in 2016, I objected to legislation that was brought in by the Canadian federal government, had already been brought in by the provincial governments, mandating certain forms of, not only certain forms of speech, but certain forms of conceptualization about what constitutes sex and gender. And I felt that it was unconscionable. There was no scientific justification for it. There is no logical justification for it. It's a completely incoherent doctrine and policy. I think it's dangerous beyond belief. I think it's an incredible intrusion on free speech. I know that the legislation is unprecedented in British common law history. And I also know that in the United States, the Supreme Court in 1942, I believe, expressly forbade precisely what the Canadian federal government did in 2016. And so because I objected to that, I got myself in a tremendous amount of political trouble because people assumed that I was bigoted against trans people and racist and homophobic and all the other things that you're tarred and feathered with if you dare to have an opinion that varies from the noisy virtue signaling minority. And after that, I think partly because I already had 300 YouTube videos up, things just exploded around me. And also I published a book in January of 2018, which added to the 2018? Yes, 2018, which it added to the general racket, let's say, and I found myself in a very strange position, traveling the world, I've traveled to 160 cities in the last year and spoken to about 350,000 people about personal responsibility and the meaning that is to be found in not in rights, but in responsibility. And no one seems to be talking about that for reasons I don't understand. And so people are starving to hear that, also for reasons I don't understand. So that's the situation now, and it's a very odd life. Although my name is not, I would say, particularly positive among certain elements of the press. I'm accused of all sorts of things that have absolutely nothing to do with who are among the most protected and privileged people that the world has ever produced. They take everything they have for granted, failing to understand entirely that there's a massive infrastructure of unbelievably hardworking, solidly laboring, working class men breaking themselves in half on a regular basis, making sure that everything that always breaks works. And so a little gratitude for that is in order. And it's very useful to tell everyone, not just men, that they have an important role to play, a necessary role, and that if they act properly and honestly and forthrightly, that they can put their lives together and they can help their families and they can make their communities better, and that that's not toxic masculinity, that appalling phrase. It's what keeps the world going round. And if we had any sense, we'd understand that instead of doing everything at every possible moment to label what we have in the West as oppressive and patriarchal and fundamentally predicated on power, of all the insane propositions. Anybody who's ever worked for a functional organization knows perfectly well that the organization isn't predicated on power. You have a boss whose fundamental motivation is power. Well, first of all, the probability that he's going to be successful is very low because everyone will be working against him behind the scenes. The people who are successful are good mentors, and they're hard workers, and they're productive, and they're competent, and they do their job properly, and they do everything they can. My observation has been that they do everything they can to find junior colleagues who have potential and possibility and work diligently to further their careers, and find that a major, if not the major, source of satisfaction in their life. Certainly the people I've met in my life who've been very successful, and I've met many very successful people, are thrilled to death when they can find someone who's young and willing and able and conscientious and straightforward and diligent, and they open doors for them in every direction they can possibly manage. And none of that's credited to the oppressive, capitalist, patriarchal system, which also is doing miracles, is performing miraculously all around the world, raising the standard of living of poor people everywhere in the world at a rate that's unprecedented in human history. The UN itself, which I would hardly regard as a pro-capitalist organization, believes that absolute poverty will be eradicated by the year 2030 in its totality. It's been halved since between 2000 and 2012. We're moving rapidly towards a post-poverty world economy where no one is starving except for political reasons. And there's no gratitude for that either.
You think capitalism is?
There's absolutely no doubt about it. It's the collapse of the Soviet Union and the catastrophic economic policies that the communists implemented, especially in places like South America and Africa. And the burden of that has been lifted at least slightly. And so we start to see some semi-sane economic policies that reward people for their own entrepreneurial productivity and provide them with a modicum of security. And we're producing surpluses in every possible direction. Free electronic communication for everyone in the world, rapid dissemination of fresh water and sanitation facilities, markedly reduced child mortality, which is now in sub-Saharan Africa down to the same levels it was in Europe in 1952. It's an absolute miracle, and no one's aware of it. And it's to be laid at the feet of the dissemination of the idea of individual sovereignty and free market principles around the world. And if you dare to put yourself forward as a spokesperson for the poor, you could do nothing better but to hope that we make everybody on the damn planet as rich as we possibly can as quickly as possible, because the evidence also suggests that as soon as you get people's as soon as you get the GDP of a country up above $5,000 a year, then people start to take care of the environment. And so you see in places like China and in India, there are more forests now than there were 30 years ago. There's more forests in the Northern Hemisphere than there were 100 years ago. There's all sorts of things even on the biological front that are positive in ways that people don't know about. It's not to say we don't have our troubles. I would say the oceans are overfished badly, and that's a big mistake, but that's a tragedy of the commons. But most things are far better than they've ever been, and there's so little gratitude for that it's a form of incomprehensible miracle to me.
In our documentary, we're focusing on male-female relations in Canada and in the West and on feminism. So I'd like to get back to that point, because that was one of the things that you mentioned. Do you think that men are having a more difficult time today than women?
Oh, that's very hard to say. I don't think men are encouraged. I think they're discouraged actively right from day one. Whether that makes them have a harder time than women is very difficult to say. I think those things are best judged on an individual level. I mean, I was thinking about, and then if you think about it historically, well, it's 2019. Well, imagine 1919. Well, that would have been 4 years of a terrible war with tens of thousands of people dead, and then the Spanish influenza. It could be a hell of a lot worse than it is now. And so we have our problems. I think the most serious is a form of strange political polarization that threatens, to some degree, that seems to threaten the stability of our political systems and the civility of our society. But it depends on your grounds of comparison. It's not like we're starving. It's not like we're in the middle of a plague. There's no civil war. Things could be a hell of a lot worse. But there's a pernicious social viciousness that's emerged over the last 10 years that I think is disheartening to people, and it would be nice if that would dissipate, and perhaps it will. Perhaps people will gain their senses and stop causing unnecessary trouble. I mean, it's not surprising to me to some degree. we have a technical problem. And the technical problem fundamentally is that the birth control pill radically altered the relationship between men and women. It turned women into creatures who did not know who they were. And unsurprisingly, because an entire plethora of new options opened up, and it destabilized the relationship between men and women for the same reason. And it's not easy to understand the new dynamic that should or could emerge as a consequence of women having voluntary control over their reproduction. So to me, it's in large part the male-female issue is the upheaval of something that's the equivalent of a major biological mutation. So we've had 40 years to figure that out. It's like we haven't figured it out. I think that we've also compounded that by doing almost nothing but lying to young women, because that's all we do to young women. You know, we tell them that, well, first of all, that career is the most important thing in life, which there is no evidence whatsoever that that's true. If you look at standard public opinion polls, you find that 75% of people regard their family and their friends as the most important part of their lives.
Men as well.
Men as well, yes. It's the social, well, Jesus, most careers aren't careers, they're jobs. How many bloody people have a career? And even if you have a career, what makes you think it's worth giving up a family for? What are you going to do when you're 50 and 60 and 70 and you're alone? And believe me, there's going to be plenty of people facing that. And, you know, so it's no solution. And to tell young women that their fundamental orientation in life is going to be a career is a complete lie. It's not only not true conceptually, because that isn't how people are oriented, but it's untrue demographically, because what happens to the vast majority of women, even professional women, is that when they hit their 30s, their early 30s, they cut back radically on their career commitments and start to focus on having a family. And no bloody wonder, because, well, you better get at it. That's the first thing, because 30's pushing it. And second, well, what makes you think that your job is so all-consuming and meaningful? You mostly get paid to do things that you don't want to do, which is why you get paid for them. You know, there's this tiny fraction of people who have hyper-interesting creative careers, and they're a tremendously tiny proportion of the population. And even those people, it isn't obvious to me, have lives that are better served by their extraordinary careers than they would be served by normative family arrangements. And you need people, you need an intimate partner, you need children and grandchildren. These aren't optional. And to tell young women that that's part of the propaganda of the oppressive patriarchy is, you could hardly do them a more cruel disservice. And they will discover that when they're 30. You know, it's why the law firms lose all their women in their 30s. They all go and take part-time jobs or work 9 to 5. They're not interested in the C-suite. Do you know how goddamn hard you have to work to be a C-suite executive? It's 80 hours a week. I know some insane men that work in the C-suite, you know, and the mystery isn't why there are few women in the C-suite. The mystery is why there are any men at all in the C-suite, because all they do is work. And they have a tremendous amount of responsibility. And you think, well, they have many millions of dollars and they have their yachts and their freedom. And, you know, that's trust fund people or people who are benefiting from unearned oil revenue in the Middle East, you know, the parasitical rich, let's say, who aren't productive. But most of the people who occupy themselves in business have thousands of employees that they're responsible for, and unbelievably heavy responsibilities. And they pay a huge price for that, because all they do is work. Now, some men in particular, and some women, but a fewer proportion of women, some men are wired like that. And wherever you put them, they're going to work 80 hours a week because they're hyper-conscientious, and it's in their nature. But I wouldn't necessarily recommend it as a recipe for a balanced life, even though the rest of us might be reasonably pleased that there are at least some people who are willing to do that. But to think of that as a target for ambition it's just not realistic for the vast majority of people. Who wants that? Why would you want to work 80 hours a week? It's exactly what, I know this. I worked with female lawyers for a decade, high-performing female lawyers. And all of them woke up at 29 or 30 once they'd made partner and thought, what the hell am I doing? I'm working constantly. I mean, the salaries were very good. The level of income was very high, but they were usually married to men who also had very good incomes because those two things tend to correlate very highly. Women generally marry men who have incomes who are higher than theirs. They're thinking, well, how about if I have a life? You know, which is a perfectly reasonable question. And so, but a lot of it's confusion. You know, but what I also don't understand, especially from the feminists, is that if the goddamn oppressive male patriarchy is such a hellish structure bent on the oppression and domination of everyone in the world, why in the world are women encouraged to flock into it and occupy all the positions of power? That makes no sense to me at all. Is it supposed to be magically transformed in its oppressive nature merely because women happen to be doing exactly the same jobs that men were? Are the women magical in some sense and are going to decrease the degree to which the oppressiveness occurs? There's no evidence for that. You know that women who have male bosses are happier on average than women who have female bosses. The data, the psychological data on that are quite clear. So there's no evidence that women run more compassionate or efficient organizations than men. And I don't know why you would expect them to, because men and women are more the same than they are different, even though the differences aren't trivial. So, and the idea that there are no differences between men and women, which is the standard social constructionist line, is only indicative of an ignorance of biology that's so profound that it should be criminal. So there's many differences between men and women, and morphologically, physiologically, psychologically, temperamentally, hormonally, developmentally, right from in utero exposure to different sex hormones. And these are not trivial matters, and they have not a determining effect, but a crucial effect. And you see these especially manifested in the extremes, which is why, for example, that the rates of incarceration of men are 10 to 15 times those of women. That's not sociological. It's because there's a small proportion of men who are hyper-aggressive, and you can identify them when they're 2. So, you know, the social constructionists, Judith Butler and people like that, they know absolutely nothing about biology. Nothing. And their ignorance of biology is so profound that they don't even think that they need to know anything about biology because it's not real. It's all a social construct. And it does no one any good. We know in the Scandinavian countries, you know, here's a statistic. The freer the country, the fewer women in the STEM fields. Now explain that. It's easy. If you allow women their choice, they go into professions that care for people. If you allow men their choice, they go into professions that deal with things. And the freer the society, the more that happens. And so the Scandinavians are in this strange position where they've maximally freed their sexes by introducing socially egalitarian legislation. And one of the fundamental consequences is that the differences between men and women in Scandinavia are bigger than they are anywhere else in the world, both in terms of occupational choice and personality. And the Scandinavians have no idea what to do about that. It was a shock to everyone, including the psychologists who discovered it. But what are we going to do? We're going to force little boys and little girls to be exactly the same? We're going to set up a huge bureaucracy to start to hyper-socialize them when they're tiny so that they become identical in every way by the time they're adults? You really think that's going to work? You have to be arrogant beyond conception and cruel to think that such a policy would be either viable or reasonably implemented.
Jordan, you're touching on a lot of things right now, and there are some things that I have some arguments for, but I'd like to separate a few things and try to get a few things clearer from you. And one of them is, it sounds when I hear you talking that you would be in favor for a more traditional gender role division. Is that true?
Well, no, not necessarily, but I'm certainly in favor of a more traditional familial structure. It's like, have some damn kids. What are you going to do with your life? You know, you've got your...
What's the difference between a more traditional familiar structure and a more traditional gender role division?
Well, you know, perhaps we can set it up so that men have the opportunity to spend more time with their kids. You know, now exactly how we're going to do that isn't obvious, because it seems to me that men are not well equipped to take care of infants under a year old. I don't see that they're good at that at all. That's been my experience and my observation. And
your own experience?
Well, no, my observation as well. But men get better at it as the children get older, and they're perfectly capable of establishing extremely tight relationships with their kids, especially I think after they're old enough to start to engage in rough and tumble play, which starts to happen really after about 9 months. The men can really start to step in. In my view, I think that for the first year of life, of a child's life, the woman's role is to take care of the baby, and the man's role is to take care of the woman and the baby, and to step in and to stop her from becoming exhausted, and to make sure that things go smoothly. And then the couple can negotiate the roles after that and make them as egalitarian as they want or can manage. And there's nothing wrong with having men deeply involved in their family structures. It's to their benefit. Clearly, the most detrimental predictor of poor long-term outcome for children is fatherlessness. And of course, that's something no one will talk about either, because, well, every family's the same, and it doesn't matter if you have a father. Well, it turns out to bloody well matter a lot, because if you don't have a father, you're far more likely to become pregnant as a teenage girl. You hit puberty earlier. You're way more likely to be alcoholic. Your rates of mental illness go through the roof, and if you have sons, they're far more likely to be criminal, incarcerated, and drug addicted. And it's not a trivial effect. And so men are necessary in families, and the more time they spend with their children, proper time, the better. And so that's not exactly traditional. I'm not suggesting that women stay home with the babies constantly and have 10 of them while the men go off to work like they did 40 years ago, or say 60 years ago. There's more intelligent ways of organizing a family, but we should get our priorities straight. And a birth rate of 1.2 or whatever it is that we have that characterizes the Western world at the moment is not. It's the sign of a very unhealthy society. It's the sign of a society that's lost the idea of the divinity of the virgin mother and the child. And it's not a good thing. So, and I don't see any evidence that it's improved people's qualities of life. All of the demographic evidence suggests that women have become increasingly unhappy since the early 1960s. So, you know, the cross-sectional studies continually conducted year after year show precisely that. And it could easily be because they're taking on more and more responsibility. You think, well, you have a career and it's fulfilling and all of that, but it's not just fulfilling, it's stressful and difficult. And if you have a career and a family, especially if you're a single mother, well, good luck to you, man. You're run off your feet non-stop, and you're a target for every predatory male in the neighborhood. It's not a pleasant mode of existence, and it's not one I would recommend for people, even though there are many single mothers who do, heroic work, doing the best they can for their families, but they're completely overwhelmed. You can't work and have kids and be single? How the hell could you do that? It's 2 full-time jobs, at least, and that's only if you have 1 kid. So, and we don't know how to solve a lot of these problems, because it turns out that having children is very expensive, and farming them out to daycare doesn't make economic sense. You can do the calculations on the back of an envelope and figure that out in about 15 minutes if you're vaguely arithmetically inclined and would actually like to know the facts. So, you need a trained childcare worker, so that's maybe $45,000 a year. You have to double that for overhead. That includes the buildings and the rest of the structure, especially if the children are young. So that's $90,000 a year. Well, and then if you have young children, the largest number of children that you can place with a caregiver is 3, possibly 4, but if they're young enough, let's say 3, that's $30,000 a child. Well, that's post-tax money. Well, if you have 2 children, how many people make enough money to spend $60,000 a year having someone else take care of their children? And that problem isn't going to go away. You're going to hire untrained workers to take care of the children. You're going to have substandard physical infrastructure to provide them with. There's no one's figured that out economically.
Well, the Scandinavians seem to have figured it out with cheap childcare or even state-funded childcare, and also a paternal leave that's divided.
And what's their birth rate?
Well, but why is that so important, the birth rate? Because it's.
Well, I don't know what's so important. I mean, that's part of the question. Yeah. Well, what's important? Well, children are important, and one isn't enough.
No?
First of all, we don't even know if children can be raised on their own. I mean, how? We don't know.
I was raised on my
I mean, it happens, but you know, the natural human environment is for children to be surrounded by other children, and we have no idea how much socialization occurs as a consequence of having siblings. You know, you think, well, you're raised by your parents. It's like, no, not in a standard human environment. Mostly you're raised by your siblings and your friends, and if you don't have any siblings, then well, what does that do to you? Well, you don't know, and no one knows. But it makes you different than you would otherwise be. I would say one of the things that it's likely to do is to make you substantially more narcissistic than you would otherwise be. And that's obviously no slur on you. But, you know, siblings keep each other in place. And they teach you how to interact under very competitive conditions with other people. And they play with you, and they're role models for you. And, you know, we don't know if a structure of 2 parents and 1 child is stable or healthy. We know nothing about that. And my suspicions are that it's not, because children need other children. So
now we do see that the Scandinavian countries, and I don't include Holland in that, people tend to include Holland,
yeah.
But I don't think we are a Scandinavian country, that they score highest on happiness, so they must do something right.
Well, they're rich.
But there are also other rich countries, but then...
Yes, and most of the rich countries score quite high on happiness. The Scandinavians do particularly well, but the difference between them and the Canadians and the Americans and so forth isn't that great. I mean, they are actually quite staggeringly rich, especially the Norwegians, since they have all their oil money. And so there's multiple reasons why their societies are stable. They're also homogenous countries in the large, which also seems to be something that contributes to the stability of communities, according to the work of Robert Putnam from Harvard. And they're small countries, and they're relatively easy to govern. And so there's multiple reasons why the Scandinavians might be doing well. And their egalitarian policies are perhaps part of it, but it takes careful analysis to pull those things apart.
Yeah,
and measuring happiness is no straightforward thing either. And I would say that their alcoholism rates are relatively high. So
it's a complex question.
Yeah,
I know I studied psychology.
It is. It's a complicated question, and the Scandinavians. But I wouldn't underestimate the degree to which general economic prosperity and a relative heterogeneity or homogeneity of social expectation is a major contributor.
But I'm just trying to find out: do you or do you not think that gender equality is also something that leads to happiness, that makes couples happier?
Well, it depends on what you mean by equality.
Well,
you know, if you mean, well, the equality is a very complicated word because people use it to signify equality of outcome, which I think is absolutely an appalling concept, or they use it to signify equality of opportunity. And equality of opportunity means set your society up so those who have the talent have the untrammeled ability to express it. Well, great. Anyone with any sense, even if they were greedy, would agree with that. I mean, if you're talented, let's say you're a great musician. Well, I'd just as soon you had the chance to show that because maybe I could listen to your music. You know, you have to be a fool not to be in favor of equality of opportunity. Talent is in short supply, and we need to encourage it wherever we can possibly discover it, independent of race, creed, and color, and gender, and all of those things, sex. And so people shouldn't hide their light under a bushel. We've known that forever. But then to equate that with equality of outcome and to say that, well, because there are differences in, let's say, the sex representation by sex at different strata of different organizations, that's a consequence of some sort of fundamental sociological oppression is an entirely different argument, as well as being different than the argument that all of the outcomes should in fact be the same if the society was equal, because there's no evidence that men and women given free choice will choose the same outcomes. And why would they? I mean, look, here's a question. Diversity, inclusivity, equity, the triumvirate, right? The modern triumvirate. Equity is equality of outcome. Okay, let's talk about diversity. Are people different or not? Well, if they're diverse and diversity is worth pursuing, then people are different. Or they're not. It's one or the other. So if they're diverse, they're different. Well, if they're different, if you let them manifest their diversity, you're not going to get equality of outcome. It's so incoherent that it defies comprehension. It's like if people were the same, well, then you get equality of outcome. And if they were the same, then you wouldn't have to worry about diversity. But if they're different, importantly different, culturally or biologically, whatever the reasons you happen to come up with, and you leave them be, they're going to pursue their individual, idiosyncratic, diverse interests, and that's going to produce an entire plethora of unequal outcomes. And in fact, we mostly work for unequal outcomes. You know, I mean, you have a career, you picked a specific career. You don't expect to be absolutely equal with everyone else on every single parameter because you specialized in something and you're hoping that you can develop some expertise that ratchets you up a competence hierarchy so that you're good for something and so that you have some opportunities. And that's all associated with unequal outcomes as well. And there's supposed to be something bad about that? It's like it's what we're striving for. It doesn't mean that people are happy when they walk down the street and see a homeless person lying there, you know, half frozen to death and alcoholic in their sleeping bag. No one wants that. But those problems are very difficult to solve. You think, well, it's an economic problem. It's like, not usually. It's usually a mental illness problem, or it's an addiction problem, or most commonly it's an alcoholism problem. And throwing money at that is not going to help. So, you know, we have these hyper simplified solutions for problems that are so complex that fools leap in where angels fear to tread. And we associate poverty with lack of money. And that's both the conservatives and the liberals do that. And it's the height of hypersimplification because people's problems are far more complicated than their mere economic difficulties. It would be lovely. I was thinking about this the other day when I was writing. It's like, it would be lovely to believe that the 1%, you know, who control the world's resources are somehow protected in some fundamental way against the catastrophes and tragedies of existence. But they're not. You meet people who are well off, you know. They have a buffer. It's better than to be poverty-stricken. It's certainly better than to be homeless. But the relationship between happiness and income comes to a halt at about middle-class level, and I don't care how much money you have, you're still going to get Alzheimer's disease. You're still going to get cancer. The people that you love are still going to die. You're still going to fight with your children. You're still going to divorce your spouse. I mean, you're not protected nearly as well by your money as everybody would like to hope. You know, and that's actually rather sad because wouldn't it be lovely if we could have 1% of the population who are actually in a glass bubble protected from the catastrophes of life, and at least other people can strive for that. But it's nowhere near that simple.
Now again, we have to separate a few things because I'm gonna get some water. Because you're touching upon, every time you're touching upon a lot of different things, so it's also difficult for me to choose what I'm reacting to.
No problem.
So I heard you say this before, that this, when you were confronted with several facts of women being oppressed in the past, that you say, well, that's an awful story to tell young men. This really gets to you. Why
Well,
is that
everybody's
so?
bloody oppressed in the past. Jesus, human history is a complete catastrophic nightmare. The more you read it, the more horrified you become. It's like the vast majority of people killed in wars are men. The vast majority of people who are killed in dangerous jobs are men. It's not like either of us had an easy time. I mean, the huge problem for women prior to the 20th century was death in childbirth. At least we got that under control. And you could say, well, women didn't have all the rights that men had for quite a substantial amount of time, but it wasn't like most men had rights. Christ, what percentage of Eastern Europeans were serfs until 1850? The vast majority of people in the feudal ages were essentially slaves. The men didn't have any rights. Most men didn't get the vote until very late, and women got it afterwards, but not that many decades afterwards. And to construe the history of the human race as the pervasive oppression of women by men it's a story invented by women who have never had a satisfactory relationship with a single man in their entire life. Not a brother, not a father, not a husband, not a son, nothing. Because if they had a satisfactory relationship, they would not be driving that narrative forward.
You really do believe that?
I absolutely. Why would I not believe it? What's the counter evidence?
Well, the counter evidence are all those facts that women used to have less rights, like voting, but also
yes,
owning
but you're
property.
looking at tiny periods of history.
Tiny.
Of course, for the vast majority of human history, most people were slaves. Men and women. There were very few free people. And then in the West, for since the Enlightenment, a small and increasingly large percentage of men started to develop a certain amount of freedom. And that spread very rapidly over the period of over a minimum number of hundreds of years. It spread, I think, as fast as it possibly could have, given all of the things that have to happen in order for that kind of equality to manifest itself. And we don't even know what the preconditions are for that equality. You can walk down the street in Holland safely. No. Compared to most places in the world, you can walk down the streets in Holland safely. Most of the places in the world, you can't walk down the streets safely. Well, how long does it take to establish a society that's civilized and sophisticated enough so that one of the primary hallmarks of your freedom would be the ability merely to walk somewhere unaccompanied?
You say we should be thankful. Women should be thankful.
I didn't say women should be thankful. I said people should be thankful that we've managed these things and that we freed so many people in such a short time. The social constructionists, their view of history is 300 years long, if that. Usually it's more like a decade. You look at this over any reasonable period of time, that freedom has spread among people so rapidly, especially in the last 500 years, that it's an absolute bloody miracle. Most men didn't have the vote 150 years ago. So we're looking at very small periods of time. And the proclivity for freedom to spread and for equality to spread is very, very powerful. And there's virtually no one opposing it. In the span of a single lifetime, it seems like things are progressing rather slowly, but from a cultural perspective, the rate of change is so fast that that we can barely keep up with it. And I don't believe for a moment that the typical woman has fewer opportunities now than the typical man. I don't see that that's true at all. I don't think the facts support I certainly don't think the facts support that that's true. Women are outperforming men at every level of the economic hierarchy. They don't do as well economically once they graduate, but that's partly because of the majors they determine to take and because of the choices they make with regards to their career strategies. So this narrative of oppression it's so resentful and so ungrateful and so unrealistic and so historically ignorant that it's a miracle to me that people can swallow it. Human history is simple. Things were terrible before 1895. Terrible. The average person in the West lived on less than $1 a day. In today's money, which is half the current rate that the UN regards as abject poverty, right? You were going to be pregnant from the time you were 14 till the time you were 30. And the chances are that you were going to live through that was like 0. Your parents were going to be dead, at least one of them. You were going to lose at least half your children. You're going to spend the vast majority of your time in back-breaking work. Your life was hard in a way that modern people can barely imagine. And there's been an economic miracle of unparalleled significance in the last 150 years. And we have so much more than we had then that the world isn't even vaguely the same. And yet we read backwards and we say, well, men were privileged. Which bloody men were privileged? Exactly. I mean, let's get down to the nuts and bolts of it. Who were privileged? The serfs who tilled the land? The knights who defended the feudal communities? The kings, perhaps, although I'm not so sure you would have wanted to live in a drafty and freezing castle with no plumbing or electricity or heating or entertainment through ice-cold winters with the constant threat of war. The men went off to war constantly. There were endless numbers of devastating plagues. No one had enough to eat. It's like, and now what are we doing? We're quibbling about whether men or women had a rougher time. It's like, Jesus, you know. And then what? There was no cooperation between men and women? What's that? Men help raise children. Do you know how rare that is in the mammalian community? It's almost unheard of. And they actually do a pretty good job. Most men love their children. And so where's the oppression? Some temporary imbalance in rights. As the idea that universal human suffrage was an appropriate idea slowly manifested itself from about 1500 onward, eradicating slavery, bringing in universal suffrage over a very short period of time. 5 100-year-old men. That's the span of time we're talking about. And now we have this narrative that men were fundamentally oppressing women since the beginning of time. It's like, here's a question for you. Answer this. Marriage is a patriarchal institution. That goes along with the patriarchal oppression narrative. Okay, fine. Why do rich women marry? Because they're the only ones that do. Because marriage is now a privilege reserved for the rich. And if you're married, you're much less likely to separate. You're much more likely to have a stable family. You're much more likely to have a stable income, especially if you're a woman. If you fall down the economic chain, you have a series of short-term relationships, most of them involving people living together. You're much more likely to separate. You're much more likely to end up alone. And so if marriage is a patriarchal institution, then why are the rich engaging in it?
Okay, let me, because we don't have a lot of time, I can't really pursue this further. I would like to, because I could, of course, go into the fact that right now it's not a patriarchal institution anymore because women do have equal rights, and in the past women used to get fired when they got married and all of this sort of stuff, but I'm not going to go into that because we need to shift to another topic. Because what we're also looking at here...
well, that mostly happened in the 1950s. That wasn't even true for most of the 20th century.
All right, but let's not go into that further. Because we're looking at how it could be that Canada has had 2 incidents of anti-feminist violence. The attack at the Polytechnique College and the Toronto van attack, of course.
Yes.
So you lived in Montreal, and I was wondering if you, when you first heard about the Montreal massacre, how was that for you?
Well, there's no shortage of insane and resentful men, you know, and they strike innocence in all sorts of different ways. There's the same pathological thought processes characterize the people who shoot up elementary schools or high schools. You know, there are people who brood and dwell on their failures and their resentment and and the rejection by the general social community, and often by people of the opposite sex, but often by people of the same sex, even with friendships. And they sit in their basements or in the hellholes they've created for themselves, and they fantasize about taking revenge on the world for the inequities that have been delivered upon them. And then they act. And they're very rare, and they're very unpredictable, and we don't know what to do about them. And they gather a tremendous amount of press coverage and notoriety for their actions, and that's part of what drives it. It's a terrible thing, but it isn't a problem that we know how to solve, because we can't identify the precursors, and we can't stop the publicity. So it's terrible. I don't think that there's any evidence that that particular form of appalling insanity is more frequently directed contrasexually than generally.
Yeah, but we're looking at these two attacks. So
yeah,
perhaps
well, those are terrible attacks.
And, interpretation of why it happened here in Canada.
No,
you don't.
I don't. Well, certainly not in a place like Montreal. I mean, well, or Toronto for that matter. They're pretty civilized cities. I mean, I don't think you can find a safer city anywhere in the world for women than Toronto and Montreal. Christ, in Montreal, you can walk around, if you're female, you can walk around unaccompanied everywhere all the time, and virtually you're as safe as you are anywhere in the world. It's the same in Toronto. So there's no explaining fundamentally rare and random acts. You know, this incel character, I mean, I was interviewed in the New York Times about that, and I made a comment that monogamous societies tend to be more stable, which is an absolutely obvious anthropological finding that everyone who's even vaguely educated has known for at least 100 years. And the reporter made much of that, suggesting that I had this idea that, undeserving men should be delivered up women on a platter by some sort of state institutional function, which is not only something that I certainly don't believe, but nobody who's sane has ever believed since the beginning of time. This man who drove over his victims was resentful and full of hatred. And I said that. He had a hatred for God. He had hatred for being. Why? Because he was rejected. I'm not excusing it. It's terrible. There's no excuse for him whatsoever. He should have gone out and made some friends. He should have gone to the gym. He should have put himself together. He should have got educated. I don't know. It's also possible that he had a mental illness that wasn't curable. There's no shortage of people who are barely clinging to the edges of the world with their fingertips, and now and then one of them slips off and does something terrible. And it's very difficult to draw general conclusions from that, except that such things happen. The only thing I would say about that is that if you're going to perform an act like that, you usually spend many, many months or many, many years fantasizing about it and the notorious aftermath that will glorify your name. And there's nothing in that that's good. And I've never suggested for a moment that men who are rejected by women should do anything but look to themselves and improve themselves so that they make themselves into the kinds of partners who would be voluntarily attractive to women who were making voluntary choices, which is obviously the only sort of solution that's ever going to work anyways. So they're terrible catastrophes. And besides, there's no reason to assume necessarily even that the person who undertook the attack is fully cognizant of their own motives. We don't trust politicians. I don't know why we'd trust mass murderers to tell us exactly what was going on in their minds the moment before they perpetrated their terrible crime. But I certainly don't think that it reflects specifically on Canadian society. I can't see how that can possibly be true, given that, we're among a handful of countries who are essentially egalitarian in their, not only in their legal structures, but in their entire society. Women saturate the workplace in Canada and have for 40 years, certainly since I've been, especially in the professions that I've occupied, the vast majority of my colleagues and my students have been women. It's par for the course, and it's not a surprise or a shock to anyone. or anything that anyone is complaining about, as far as I can tell. I just think mostly when I think about it that I find it sad because I've seen so many women, especially in their early 30s, desperate to have children. And I'll tell you that if you want to spend a miserable decade, one good way to do it is to wait till you're 30 to try to have children and then to find out that you can't. That's no picnic. And your chances at that point, if you're a couple at 30, is 1 in 3 is fertility difficulties, which is defined as unlikelihood of or inability to conceive within 1 year of attempting it. And so I don't know precisely how it is that people go about balancing their requirement for an intimate relationship and a family and their career. It's a very, very difficult problem to solve, just like how to raise children is a difficult problem to solve because it's so incredibly expensive. I don't know how you solve that economically because the utility of children economically is deferred decades into the future, and we don't know how to fund that.
I want to get back to the attack again, because of course a lot of people are saying that it's a backlash against feminism, and in the case of the Polytechnique massacre, that was really clear.
Yeah, they say that because it's in their own best political interest. It's 2 bloody people. What are you going to do? You're going to generalize from 2 insane people. When was the Polytechnique massacre? How long ago?
89.
Right, so it's more than 20 years ago. And you had this attack a year ago. It's 2 attacks, 35 million people, 2 attacks in 3 decades. You're going to draw generalized political conclusions from that. And then you're going to assume that those generalized political conclusions aren't a consequence of your own motivations. What's that, a random sample or something? 2 insane people? That's no random sample. There's no drawing conclusions from that. You remember the man who shot up the elementary school in the Eastern Seaboard in the United States? You're going to draw a conclusion from him? You're going to say something general about society because someone was insane enough to go kill children? You can't do that. You can barely generalize about social trends if you do a random stratified poll. Even those things haven't been accurate recently in predicting political outcomes. So it's all well and good for people who are already grinding an axe to say that these acts are, indicative of widespread attitudes towards women. It's like 2 attacks out of 35 million people in 30 years is not indicative of widespread antipathy towards women.
Now these are 2 attacks, of course, just 2, but you have this huge red pill community online, and you must be familiar with the red pill community.
I'm vaguely familiar with them,
yeah.
But
so,
what of it?
Well, their whole thinking is that feminism is oppressing men.
No, their whole thinking is that radical social justice warriors are polarizing society. And that's exactly what's happening. So you can't accuse the red pill society of holding viewpoints that are even vaguely commensurate with people who commit crimes of that magnitude. There's nothing fair about that at all. It's like painting half the population in the United States. Half the population is Republican, has been for the last 40 years. They tend towards more conservative perspectives on many, many things. It has nothing to do with antipathy towards women. Unless you assume that it's only the liberals that have the best interests of women in mind, and I certainly don't believe that at all. I don't think that the liberals do, especially the radical, I'm not the liberals so much because they're more in the center, but the radical left types, I don't think they have the best interests in women in mind at all. In fact, I don't think they have anybody's best interests in mind. And to identify a vague amalgam of loosely connected people online who discuss in a meme-like fashion being red-pilled with some generalized vicious antipathy towards women, I think there's no evidence for that at all. A tremendous amount of it is merely adolescent trolling. And mainstream media people don't understand what happens online at all. These people, there's plenty of people there who do what they do merely to distract and confuse the mainstream media types who have no idea what the culture actually constitutes. And they do it with incredible effectiveness. They play them for fools all the time. The whole Pepe thing was a perfect example of that. That right-wing conspiracy that was supposed to manifest itself in some, horrible, bloody uprising just vanished as soon as the Trump election was over. So we don't understand these internet communities, and to assume that they're somehow associated with the desire for violence against women is I think there's no evidence for that whatsoever. And certainly I don't think that's the case of the red pill community, such as it is. Most of them are people were more left-leaning and liberal, who've converted to some degree to a more conservative perspective, mostly because the liberal center keeps moving left and leaving so many people that were once liberal behind. Most of the people who are in the IDW were liberals. Joe Rogan's a liberal as far as he's concerned. Dave Rubin's a liberal as far as he's concerned. Ben Shapiro isn't, but Shapiro's a political pundit, so you can hardly expect it from them. I never thought of myself as a conservative. I'm a social scientist, and I know perfectly well that it's dangerous to experiment on large scale with untested social policies on populations that haven't precisely agreed to the parameters of your experiment, because the probability that you have the diagnosis correct and the answer at hand is zero.
Let's make this more concrete. What is it exactly that you think is so dangerous? What is it exactly that you think is so dangerous?
I think the doctrine of equality of outcome is dangerous.
Can you explain that?
Because it forces all the individuality out of people. It denies the individuality.
Because equality of outcome, of course, is a very
the assumption that, here's the assumption. If at every level of at every hierarchical level of every organization, every demographic group is not represented in the same proportion as they're represented in the population, then the reason for that is systemic oppression on the part of the patriarchal of the patriarchy. Let's leave it at that. Well, that's just not the case. Yeah. That isn't the reason for it. And why is it dangerous? Because it invokes the demand for social policies to redress the problem, which is impossible. There are too many different kinds of people. First of all, maybe you work for gender parity or sex parity in terms of wages. Well, first of all, that's extraordinarily difficult. Just that, and that's a single dimension. You're going to do that for race, you're going to do that for ethnicity, you're going to do that for social class, you're going to do that for attractiveness, you're going to do that for the multitude of genders that apparently exist. You're going to equate for all of that?
But Jordan, I think you're making an assumption that this is what people want. Well,
they're the ones that are advocating for equity.
Who are?
Well, what do you mean, who are?
I don't know.
The entire basis of the social justice movement.
Who are these people?
Who are these people? Well, mostly they're people who occupy academic positions in the social sciences and the humanities. And they're people who work primarily in human resources departments, for example, in large corporations. And then there's a large swath of the general mainstream media who holds similar views. There are people who are on the farthest left extreme of the political continuum. It's only about 7% of the population that holds views of this type, although they're much more highly represented than that in university settings. And this is the agenda that they've promoted. So, maybe it's not the same in Holland, but the diversity, equity, and inclusivity mantra it's like the central policy of our entire federal government. It was the central policy of the provincial government before they got demolished, thankfully, in the last election. It's the new morality. It's not something I'm just inventing out of whole cloth. It's trumpeted everywhere. Christ, the Law Society in Ontario last year, the people who ran the Law Society made it a regulation that if you had a law firm of a certain size, and not that big, that you had to write a statement proclaiming your allegiance to the principles of diversity, inclusivity, and equity on pain of, well, it was unspecified at the point, but the eventual threat was loss of your legal license. Well, thankfully, this year, a woman spent 18 months garnering up a new slate of candidates to run the Ontario Law Society and chased all the radicals out of the organization, and hopefully they've scrapped the requirement. But it's pervasive in the elementary school curriculums. It's pervasive in the junior high school curriculums. It's taught in all of the gender and ethnic studies departments in the universities. It characterizes the viewpoints, as I said, of a substantial proportion of social scientists and humanities. There's almost no conservatives in the social sciences and the humanities. And if you had to boil down the cliches and slogans of their political viewpoint, that's it. That's what they've picked. Diversity, inclusivity, and equity. I've never even really been able to figure out what inclusivity means. It's such an ill-defined concept. I know what diversity means. It means representation by immutable biological quality. And equity is a weasel word that means equality of outcome. And that's exactly what people are aiming for. And they make no bones about it. So I don't see how it comes as a surprise that that's the fundamentally appropriate way of summing up that particular political viewpoint.
Well, I don't know exactly how this is in Canada, but in the Netherlands, if we have quotas or whatever, people are not as strict as you present them to be. They just want equal representation as far as possible. Just that the people who
equal
normally
representation
don't get
on what basis? Oh, look, our Prime Minister, when in the last federal election, 27% of the MPs who were elected were women. 50% of the people in the cabinet were women. Now, how in the world? Two questions. A, how is that possibly fair? And B, how is it possible statistically that he picked the most competent people? It's statistically impossible.
How many people were there that he could choose from?
Hundreds.
It's hundreds, so then you still have a large enough pool.
Doesn't matter. It's a matter of pure proportion. If 75% of the people, if you have 75% of the people on one side of the room and 25% of the people on the other, and you pick the most competent people, you'll draw 3/4 of the people from the one side of the room and 1/4 from the other. It has nothing to do with the number of people.
Well, it could also be that those women worked harder to get there since they're
it
more
could be, but it
obstacles
also
for them.
couldn't be. And without stringent evidence that that was the case, I wouldn't make that assumption. Because I don't think that, first of all, 50% of women vote, or 50% of the people who can vote are women. And so if the women are interested in going into politics, which they seem to be less interested in, by the way, than men, then they have the opportunity to appeal to their gender to be elected. And I'm not going to accept the proposition that they had to work twice as hard to get where they wanted to go. Maybe they did, and maybe they didn't. And it's something that would be judged on an individual by individual case. And regardless of that, there's still absolutely no... Listen, I think that the women, the cabinet members, who took their cabinet positions who were women in the Trudeau federal government should be ashamed of themselves for the rest of their life for allowing themselves to be elevated to a position of power based fundamentally on their genitalia. There's no excuse for it. If they had an ounce of pride, they would have rejected it and said, you pick the most competent people. That's your job. It's 2015, and so we have 50% women. It's like, no, these are important positions. We appoint the people who are the most competent for the job, and we do it independently of their fundamental biological nature. That's the whole point of an egalitarian society. And you say, well, women were oppressed in the past, so these women deserve a specific advantage. And in what possible manner is that just? It doesn't offer the people who were transgressed against any recourse because they're all dead. It offers the women who are being promoted now a completely unfair advantage, and not only that, makes anyone who has any sense whatsoever skeptical of their capabilities, because I'm skeptical of the capabilities of anyone who's promoted on any basis other than merit. And if you were promoted on any other basis than merit, you should be skeptical, A, of your ethical, what would you call, ethical justification for accepting the position, and also deep in your heart at 3 in the morning when you're wondering just how competent you are, you're going to be waking up thinking, just exactly why am I here? And am I so bloody sure that I didn't take the position of someone else who deserved it more? So, and also one of the consequences of that too is that the Trudeau government has pursued an exceptionally feminist agenda, and virtually every piece of legislation that they've run through their process so far has concentrated on such things as the wage gap in Canada, which, believe me, is not the most pressing problem we have in Canada by any stretch of the imagination. It wasn't even a bloody issue until the Trudeau government came into power. So no one was even talking about it, and it was working itself out at a very rapid rate. You know, and then the whole pay gap issue is complicated beyond belief, not least because, for example, women are much more likely to work part-time, and they're likely to work shorter hours. You work 10% more hours. Do you know how much more money you make?
Just, Jordan,
40,
sorry.
You make 40% more money if you work 10% more hours.
But I want to kind of, not go into all of these different things again. So competence. The issue, of course, is, as you know, you're a psychologist, that men often get jobs in power because they're better at presenting themselves as confident.
There's very little evidence for that. The best predictors of
there's a whole book about
No,
this.
there is no evidence for that. The best predictors of being hired and being successful are intelligence as measured by IQ tests and conscientiousness as measured by the Big Five. There are tiny advantages to extroversion. There are tiny advantages to attractiveness. So it's not the case that men are better at whatever it is that takes for them to get hired at a particular job, and it's certainly not the case in most modern, high-level educated corporations. In the universities, for example, the evidence is crystal clear at the moment that if you're a female, especially in the STEM fields, your probability of being hired is overwhelmingly higher than a man with the same qualifications.
In that field, but I'm talking about powerful positions.
What about powerful positions?
There's the Dunning-Kruger effect, and you know about this, right?
Tell me the Dunning-Kruger effect.
The people who present as very confident, kind of narcissistic, are more likely to be believed by other people and to be judged as competent, even though there's no correlation between this overconfidence and actual.
Right, but it accounts for a very tiny part of the variance in the eventual outcome. We're not looking at 50% of what constitutes the probability that someone will be hired. We're looking at 2 or 3%. Look, IQ accounts for about 25% of your probability of being successful. So that leaves 75% unaccounted for. And conscientiousness accounts for another 10%. So the best two predictors together account for 45%. After that, the next best is neuroticism, and it's a negative predictor. And it only accounts for about 4%. And then these effects that you're talking about, they're trivial. They barely register. So they're certainly not accounting for the differential positioning of men and women in positions of power. And also, I would also take some exception to the conceptualization of those positions as positions of power, because I would say that they're positions of competence and authority most of the time, unless you're talking about a tyrannical dictatorship. Because the people that I know who are CEOs and CFOs and who run C-suites aren't wandering around with a mace and a club and beating people into submission if they don't do their will. They're engaged in a very, very complex and sophisticated series of negotiations on a constant basis with all of their employees. And they bear a tremendous responsibility to ensure that their employees are satisfied and happy, because if they aren't, they leave and their companies fail. And the managerial evidence suggests as well that managers are far more stressed psychophysiologically by their subordinates than subordinates are by their managers. And that's partly because if you're a subordinate, you have one manager, and if you're a manager, you have 1,000 subordinates. And so it's very difficult And so to call those positions of power, it's like, well, sometimes they are. But they're not just positions of power. First of all, power is an unstable way of establishing a hierarchy. It doesn't even work for chimps. Positions of authority, positions of competence, positions of responsibility.
Okay, let's
well, but it makes a difference. Men occupy positions of power. First of all, no, most men don't. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage. Second, why power? Why use that word? Well, it's simple. It's a derivation from a Marxist philosophy that's 150 years old, that people bandy about without ever thinking about it. You know, the people I know, seriously, the people I know who have positions of power, like they're terrified constantly that their companies are going to fall apart, or that they're not serving their employees properly, or that they're not going to make the next payroll, or that some technological transformation is going to cut their legs out from underneath them. They're not sitting in a money bin like Scrooge McDuck, throwing their coinage up in the air and triumphantly, what would you call, trumpeting their superiority to the rest of the human race. They're not interested in having slaves. They're interested in having collaborators. They're interested in mentoring people. And they're ambitious. Many of them are actually trying to accomplish important and difficult things rather than merely trying to occupy the power positions that the postmodernists love to identify. They're doing things, you know, and it's the fact that they're doing things that are giving them the positions, at least in a company that functions. When the company starts to deteriorate, and that happens very frequently, you know, and degenerate into something that's more tyrannical, then the political types who work fundamentally on power and intimidation have a chance to clamber up to the top. But by the time that's happening, the company is so damn dead, it's probably only got a lifespan of about 10 years.
Okay. Second point against this issue of people in powerful positions. Now, there are certain positions that are so important because they represent the society, like these MPs, the ministers, also judges, which are predominantly female now in the Netherlands. Wouldn't it be better to have a more equal division between men and women in those positions?
Well, it's certainly possible that it would be better. I don't know whether it would be better or not. It might be better. It could be better. It's certainly worth the experiment, but that doesn't mean that it's better to establish that by quota or by insisting on equality of outcome, because you don't know what the determinants are of equality of outcome. You know, it may be, for all you know, it might be in 20 years that 75% of the judges are women. I mean, it's happening very rapidly in all the fields that have to do with primary human care, which is also part of the reason that women's salaries are lower, because you can't scale human care. You know, if you're a computer programmer and you make a computer program, and then you can make 1 million of them. If you're a nurse, there's like you know, and so some things are very difficult to scale. And it's going to be the case that in many disciplines, women predominate. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, I have no idea, and neither does anyone else. You know, I mean, and I wrestle with it to some degree. Almost all the elementary school teachers are women. Well, is that a good thing? Well, it's good in that the women chose to be elementary school teachers and they got to follow their free choice. And so to the degree that following your free choice in a free society is a good thing, that's a good thing. Is it good for the children to only be exposed to one gender while they're being educated at such a young age? I don't know. Those are separate questions. But things are sorting themselves out quite quickly, and they're not going to sort out at 50-50. And then, so what are we going to do about that? We're going to decide that some professions should be 50-50, so that would be the C-suites, because that's where the feminists concentrate. Half the corporate executives have to be female. But they don't say that about the damn bricklayers. It's 99% of bricklayers are men, almost all heavy machinery operators, almost all construction workers.
Of course, it's about the positions of power, like judges and like MPs.
Well, power, you know, power, that's one way of thinking about it. But like, why is it any more relevant that women are underrepresented, let's say in the C-suites, than that they're underrepresented among bricklayers?
You know the answer to
No, I don't know the answer to that. If the goal is 50-50 representation, because women have been systemically, what would you call, they've been systemically excluded from trades and occupations. How do you possibly draw the line between those positions where gender equity should be pursued and those positions where it shouldn't? It's not possible. And I defy you to make an argument for why 50% of the bricklayers shouldn't be women. Why is that not just as unjust, let's say, as the fact that a smaller percentage of women occupy C-suite positions?
Well, C-suite, I'm not concerned about. I'm concerned about the MPs and the judges right now.
Same thing.
And they are representing. Bricklayers are not representing.
High-level professional positions. Then we'll go with that.
Now let's go for the MPs and the judges.
Well, they're elected or appointed. We have mechanisms for determining this already. You don't put quotas in place. There's no excuse for quotas. Because we don't know how this is going to play out.
That's your main concern, that you don't know how it's going to play out.
Well, first of all, you don't put quotas in if you don't have an equal pipeline, that's for sure. If there's 50% one sex of candidate and 50% the other, well, at least if there were quotas, you would be sampling randomly from the talent within the two populations. But if there's 10% women and 90% men, and you pick 50% of your candidates from the women, then you've picked a bad lot of candidates, statistically speaking. And not just a little bit bad. And you see, this sort of thing makes a tremendous difference, because the difference in competence between people isn't linear, it's non-linear. And so if you start to populate disciplines with substandard people who aren't competent, then you destroy the disciplines. And that happens very rapidly. It's certainly happened to many disciplines in the universities.
You think that's happened to the government?
Here? Our government's pretty stable, and you know it takes a hell of a fool to ruin it in 4 years. You know, most Western democracies have a lot of different checks and balances in place. You know, and in Canada we have a federal system, and so the provinces have a fair bit of power. And as the Liberals rose to ascendancy, I hate to call them Liberals because they're far left of what the traditional Liberals in Canada were, because they were always centrists. What's happened is that the provincial parties have become increasingly conservative. And so Canada manages to maintain a pretty decent balance of political viewpoints, I would say. And so I'm not worried to any great degree that Trudeau has done any long-term substantive damage to the Canadian political structure as such, although I think his policies have devastated Western Canada, just like his father's policies did. And that was incredibly ill-advised and is going to cause an immense amount of trouble over the next 5 or 6 years. But, you know, there's not more than a moderate chance that he's going to survive the October election anyways, depending on how foolish the Conservatives are as they attempt to oust him and how divisive their own internal politics become. So, you know, our Western countries are pretty stable. They have a lot of moving parts that tend to keep them on a relatively even keel. So I don't think the situation is dire, especially by historical standards. Worse things have happened. I think that he's been extraordinarily divisive as a leader. I do believe that the relationship between Indigenous people in Canada and the rest of the population is far worse than it was when he first took office, and is likely to become worse yet, because the drum is continually being beaten and the fundamental problems are not being addressed. The fundamental problems are like unbelievably difficult to address, and no one has the courage to do it.
Let's then go to your opinion about this missing and murdered Indigenous women report. What's your opinion?
Well, first of all, to consider that a genocide is it's like a criminal use of terminology as far as I'm concerned, because genocide has a very specific meaning as far as I'm concerned. It's state or or police, army, militia, planned militia eradication of specific populations for the purpose of eradicating them. Everyone knows that. That's not what's happening in Canada. What's happening is that there's an underclass of Indigenous Canadians who suffer for an endless plethora of reasons. Isolation, especially in northern communities, which have no hope of economic survival, no more than non-Indigenous northern communities have hope of economic survival. All the small towns in Canada have died. All the small towns in Europe are threatened. The French can't keep their small towns running, neither can the Italians. They're beautiful and ancient. They can't even keep them going. We have these little places that were scraped out of the bloody frost 50 years ago that were barely functional when they first started. They've all died. Thousands of these towns have died in places like Saskatchewan. You can't keep tiny reserves going in the north. It's completely impossible. And the rates of alcoholism are through the roof. The same with drug use, and it's no bloody wonder. It's frigid and dark 6 months of the year, and there's very little to do. Plus, there's no future. And so, you know, people migrate from those places to the city, and they get themselves in all sorts of trouble. And there's plenty of willing people to aid them in their catastrophes. And to consider that a genocide is, it's a form of false, it's a form of extortionary false compassion. It's extortion because it requires anybody who objects to the use of the term to present themselves as uncaring. And it's inappropriate because the reason that there are thousands of missing Indigenous women, and plenty, by the way, missing Indigenous men, is because of a dozen reasons, all extraordinarily complicated, and none of which are being managed properly. I would say probably alcoholism being the #1 contributor. It's a very intractable problem in small communities. It's a very dangerous drug. 50% of the people who are killed are drunk. 50% of the people who commit the murders are drunk. Your highest risk of death is drunk family member. Right? Alcohol is a very, very toxic drug, and it does terrible things to people. It impairs their judgment very badly. And so, and the problem of alcoholism is widespread, not only among the Indigenous community, but in isolated northern communities in general. But it's not like anybody knows what to do about it. It's a very difficult problem to solve. And I lived in an isolated northern community. It's no bloody wonder people drink themselves half to death for 6 months of the year. You know, it's cold, bitterly cold, it's bloody dark, and there isn't anything to do. And the communities don't have a future. So, you know, under those circumstances, people turn to alternative forms of hedonic pleasure. And it's not surprising. But genocide requires a perpetrator. So the question is, who exactly here is being identified as the perpetrator? And the second is, exactly why are they being identified as the perpetrator? And I know perfectly well the answer to the second part of that question, which is that it's very convenient for the ideologues who are underwriting the more extreme elements of these documents to make yet another case for the oppressive colonial patriarchy and to lay the responsibility at the feet of people who aren't them. So there's no excuse for it. Now, and that doesn't mean there isn't a problem. There's a problem. The relationship between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people in Canada is unstable, and it's not improving. But we don't know what to do about it. You know, I've been working with a native carver for 10 years, 15 years. I made friends with him when I went to Vancouver Island. I've been buying his artwork since then. And he carved a 53-foot totem pole that's in front of the Montreal Museum of Fine Art that commemorated the residential schools. He was a residential school survivor, and he had a childhood that was so brutal that it's almost unimaginable. It's unimaginable. That's good enough. If you heard it, you'd be suffering for the tale for a few days. And he had his slice of hell, and that's for sure. And, you know, I've done everything I could, along with a friend of mine, not to help him, because that's not the right way of thinking about it, but to engage in useful, mutual, productive trade so that he has an opportunity to pursue his livelihood, and so that I'm a beneficiary of what it is that he produces. And his circumstances are so complex that for every step he takes forward, the probability that he'll slide back at least one is almost 100%. It's family catastrophes, continual deaths, alcohol-fueled familial breakup, chronic divorce, fetal alcohol syndrome, multiple patterns of drug use, abuse on a widespread scale of men, women, and children, fragmented culture. It's very, 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 very difficult to make headway in a situation like that. And to come out with a report that says, well, this is a consequence of genocide is to take your own political conviction and hold that as your a priori axiom, and then to take all the facts that you can muster and line them up behind what you already knew so well, instead of taking the problem apart in all its hopelessness and trying painstakingly, incrementally, piece by piece, to slowly address some of the underlying issues. It's a very difficult thing to do.
So there's something that I find difficult to understand about you as a phenomenon, and that's that you're against polarization, but yet you call your opponents, like the postmodern feminists, the social justice warriors, you compare them to Nazis and to fascists.
No, I haven't compared them to Nazis.
You say they're like Marxists, and Marxists are just as bad as Nazis.
That's true, but I didn't compare them to Nazis. I compared them to Marxists.
Which are just as bad as Nazis.
Well, on an at the ethical level, yes, but it doesn't mean that they're the same they have the same political stripe. I don't like people who play group identity politics. They're promoting tribalism. Tribal societies are extraordinarily dangerous. And I think they're doing it primarily because of resentment. I certainly don't trust the Marxism, and why would I? I mean, how is it, you tell me after 150 million deaths, how it's okay to be a Marxist.
But that's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the type of language you're using to qualify your opponents. It seems polarizing as well.
It depends on the opponents. I don't like Marxists. It isn't that I don't like them. There's no excuse for it. You'd call me polarizing if I objected to Nazis? Yes or no? If I objected to Nazis, am I polarizing or not?
But you see these people who want the gender-neutral pronouns. That's basically their main point. You see them...
That's their claimed main point.
But you think they're actually more dangerous than this?
It isn't that I think they're more dangerous than this. I know they're more dangerous than this. They wouldn't have put in compelled speech legislation if they weren't more dangerous than that.
Well, they would say, we don't want discrimination.
Yes, that's what they would say. But they still put in compelled speech legislation. And that never happened before in the history of British common law. And as I already pointed out, the American Supreme Court made it illegal in 1942. You can compel speech commercially. If you sell tobacco, you can make people put a warning on their package. You cannot tell people in the United States what they have to say. It's not constitutional. Okay. Now you can do it in Canada.
But
Jordan, I don't appreciate that.
Jordan, you are all about taking responsibility for your actions. And then when I see already in our team also, we've had these really fierce discussions about things that you were saying, and there was already a schism in the team. So it seems like you are somehow a polarizing influence. And that concerns me, and I wonder if that concerns you too.
Well, of course it concerns me. The question is, what's the alternative? I've got no patience for Marxists. There's no excuse for it. There's no more excuse for it than there is for being a Nazi, in my estimation. And now maybe you should say, well, I should have patience for Nazis, but I don't.
Of course, that's not what I'm saying.
No, but
I think
it's not so clear that it's not what you're saying.
No,
because it is the Marxists that I'm objecting to. And somehow it's okay to be a Marxist. Because maybe you're for the poor, even though you're not. I don't think it's okay to be a Marxist. I don't even think it's a little bit okay to be a Marxist. I think maybe in 1918, when you didn't know any better, even though wise people had already warned against the danger for at least 50 years, then maybe you could have assumed that you would bring in the utopia with your ideas of equity. But it's 100 years later, and we've seen the carnage.
But you really see these people as the same thing as the Marxist, the Stalinist
they
Marxists.
call themselves Marxists. No, they're worse than the Stalinist Marxists. Because the Stalinist Marxists didn't know who Stalin was going to be. And we know who Stalin was, and we know who Mao was, and we know who Pol Pot was.
So let's make this clear. You really think that these people who are battling for social justice, against discrimination, that they want some sort of Stalinist regime?
Well, they wouldn't say that. No, of course they wouldn't say that. Their policies would lead inevitably to it. And God only knows what they want in their heart of hearts. You know, it's the postmodern neo-Marxist types who are always on about power. Every structure is predicated on power. Well, first of all, that's not true. But if you make that claim, then you have to ask, well, why exactly is it that you're claiming that every structure is based on power? What exactly does that have to do with your own motivations if you happen to be embedded in a structure? Does that mean, what, are you somehow immune to that if it's the only game in town? Or is it exactly what you're pursuing? And so, you know, it's not like all the people who started the Russian Revolution wanted a bloody nightmare, but that's what they got. And then there was a certain proportion of them who were perfectly happy with that outcome too. And so, no, I don't trust them. So, and I especially don't trust them because they're in a much better historical position to understand the consequences of their doctrines than people